Welcome to The Growth Project, a podcast brought to you by AMPLOS. Dr. Drew Brannon here today, joined by the soon-to-be Dr. Marlee Johnson. How does that sound as you hear that?
Sounds like it's still a little too far off.
Well, but it's on the way, and so no harm in acknowledging the fact that it'll be here before you know it, right?
It will be here way sooner than we probably
Maybe
think.
you should just tell yourself that every day, and that'll be a good source of motivation if you aren't doing that already.
One day at a time.
That's right. Good mentality. Okay, so it's great to be here. We're excited to be on the other side of our 300th episode. If you did not yet get a chance to maybe tune in for that one last week when we celebrated our 300th, that was a great time with a live event we had here locally in Greenville, South Carolina. And if you couldn't make it, or perhaps you're nowhere near Greenville and couldn't attend live, please take a second and check that out. So now on the other side of that, and here we are today, Marlee, and we're talking about organizational identity. And the reason I think this is such a worthwhile and notable topic is I think about kind of our listener population. And one of the things I love about our community and the Growth Project is we have people across like all industries, all parts of the world. That's one of the things we said last week. It's actually the Growth Project's been listened to in 113 different countries, which is kind of a cool stat, I think. But this concept of organizational identity transfers to everybody. And so I think as we get into it and thinking about how highly applicable this is, we need to start by clarifying like, what is that? Because everybody knows what an organization is. Everybody's heard the term identity, but help us understand with some clarity here, like what is organizational identity mean?
Yeah. And I love this topic too. I actually wrote my undergrad thesis on team identity. So this is very similar concept. But kind of the most basic definition of organizational identity is what are the central, enduring, and distinct things about your organization. And kind of we can break those down into those 3 points a little bit further. So
central, distinguished, and enduring.
Yes.
That's what we're dealing with. Okay, go for it. Break them down.
Yeah. So the first one is those distinctive attributes, which are what the characteristics of your organization that differentiate you from everybody else. Mm-hmm. There's a concept in psychology called optimal distinctiveness, which is this idea that we both have a need to belong somewhere, but also to be unique in a very complementary way. So this like distinctive attribute of an organization is the thing that adds functional value to the organization. It's what allows them to play in the market, but be different from everybody else.
Okay. So this is like, for anybody who's hearing this, as you think about like who you are and your identity, we love to talk about kind of, well, what makes us unique? Like what's our, people might call that your value prop. They might call it your differentiating competitive advantage, whatever it might be. So that when we say distinguish, this is what we're really talking about.
Yeah. It's the thing that makes you unique in the market. It's
cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
The other two are these central and enduring traits. So the idea here is that we're best known by what we do most often, repeatedly over time. And that's really who we are. It's your deepest commitments. So the central piece is like core values. When somebody is working for you in your organization, it's the things that they can recite off the top of their head of this is who we are. On paper, you ideally want them to say what you have in your mission values, statements, things like that.
Right.
But a lot of times there's a misalignment, but we're going for those central things to be what's core about us. And then kind of with that is this enduring piece. It's really hard for something to be core about you unless it's lasted the test of time.
Right.
So a lot of people kind of get tripped up with, well, I change over time, like who I am changes. And I think the thing with enduring is how it looks can shift and look differently in different points in time. But if a company's core value is we're innovative, that innovation may look different 100 years ago as it does today. So it's that stable core.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting as you lay those out and kind of go through them. When I think about central and enduring, I don't know if it's because we're in the South or because we've done work with these folks, but Chick-fil-A is an organization that comes to mind for me. Yeah. And one of the examples that we're all familiar with when we think about central of like clarity, closed on Sundays.
Yep.
And that's not a core value. It's more of kind of a principle that's in a practice that stems from a core value. But I remember years ago, we were down at Chick-fil-A early in kind of the working relationship of the work we've done with them over the years. And we were sitting in their like huge cafeteria, which is really cool. And it does serve things other than chicken, if you were wondering about that. They have all kinds of things, pizza, salad. They had like a stir fry thing. It was great. So we're sitting there and they were talking to us about just a lot of the history and like how things came together. And they have what's called Truett-isms. And so Truett Cathy, the founder of Chick-fil-A, a lot of the things that he said over the years, they coined the phrase of Truett-isms. And one of the ones he said, Marlee, that aligns completely to this is he used to say, the lights shine brightest on Sundays, which I think is a really cool way of saying what you're saying right now of like, hey, the lights of Chick-fil-A and who we are and our identity and who we want to continue to be for the long haul. Like, when are those things most evident? Well, in some respects, it's like on Sundays.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Because everyone else is open and we aren't.
Yeah.
And that's just been one of the ways from an identity standpoint that I know they have said, hey, this is going to be central to us. Like, this is who we're going to be. These things aren't going to change, and they're going to endure because the organization at this stage of the game certainly is existing and thriving long after the fact Truett Cathy stepped out of that role, and they're still doing things the same way.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good example of like how all three of these work together. Like, I think being closed on Sundays is distinct about nobody else is doing it. So these three things, we can break them down all separate, but they're not really separate things. They all go together. And you can probably hopefully identify them about your own organization too. Like, what are these things that are distinct and central and enduring about us? Yep.
All right. So now that we've framed that up and we're clear on, as we're talking about this term today, organizational identity, Marlee, as we think about what we've learned anecdotally in the work that we've done, and we can see this in literature reflected as well, one of the things we know about this whole concept is it's not to be taken for granted. Like this is, as easy as it is to get caught up in the whole the challenges of operating an organization and attracting talent and retaining people, and all, like, this is paramount. Like, you can't skip this.
And it's hard work. It sounds really easy, but it's hard to take time to step back and reflect on that.
So share a little bit, Marlee, on when we think about kind of the importance of this. Like, for those people who are listening to this and maybe they've either not done this work yet, or perhaps they've done this work, but it's grown kind of stale, or maybe they haven't even thought about it lately. Like, why is this important?
I think there's a lot of reasons this is important. I think the first thing that kind of pops in my head is when you have a really strong identity, it's almost acts as like this decision frame. And it's like guardrails that can help everybody in your organization. They're going to make different decisions. People are unique, but they all are at least headed in the same direction. And all your energy gets focused that way. When that's not there, then you've got people going in a million directions, even leadership going in a million directions. You get your hand in too many things, and now all of a sudden you're not doing a couple of things at 100%. You're doing a lot of things that are not really aligned with your vision and who you are at about 50 to 70%.
Yeah, great point. And I think when the idea of guardrails and decision-making framework is, like, the reality is black and white decisions are the easy ones.
Right.
And in some respects, when you get those in business and your organization is having to deal with those are like the layups.
Right.
The hard ones are the gray area.
Yeah.
And there will be no shortage of gray area decisions that you're faced with as an organization. And that is just one of many reasons why this identity piece must come to the forefront.
Right.
Of, like, when we're faced with a decision that's anything but clear, how do we make it? Like, what do we fall back on? How do we know the process to run, the questions to be asking? And so much of that stems from the identity piece, correct?
Yes, and there's a lot of research to say that naturally comes up too. It's not in these like black and white easy decisions where people are like, who am I? It's these more gray area, like you said, decisions where it comes up naturally, and people want to make decisions that are aligned with their character. Like, that's a natural human thing. Then when you get a group of people working together, that becomes a little bit harder if it's not super well articulated and people are not bought in on the same line.
Yep.
So, with personal identity, it's not easy by any means, but in some respect, a little bit easier because you're not working with multiple people trying to get on the same page toward the same thing.
Right. Okay. So let's, in the same kind of vein here, Marlee, let's also touch on ROI. Right. And so there's a study that was done in 2014. I think it's important for people to understand this as well, of like, okay, how does organizational identity impact some of the metrics that matter to people in the work that they do. And so I want to mention a couple things here. There's a study done in 2014 specifically, and these are some of the findings that we saw through the data of what impact organizational identity was having, inclusive of improving performance, improving hiring, providing better financial results. I know a few companies that care about that for obvious reasons. Motivating people. How does it motivate people? Well, it helps them see how the work that they're doing is connecting to a bigger picture, whatever that bigger picture might be. And so I think it's, a lot of things we talk about in this whole realm of performance psychology and organizational psychology, there are always going to be skeptics, and that's good, right? Because I think why do we want and why do we need skeptics? It pushes us to know what the data says. It pushes us to know what the science says. And so we see some examples here of, in just one study, and there are many, many, many others, of how this improves outcomes.
Absolutely. And I think there was another really interesting one too. I saw even customers can see through it. Customers that see that are also aligned with your brand identity, but see that what your actions are lining up, people are willing to spend twice as much money on your product or service.
Yep.
That's a crazy stat to me. People that are not even in your organization know if you're being who you say you are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you see it, like the great example is local business. Like there are local businesses in every community where, if you're running your local business well and you're treating your employees well and you're providing good benefits, that's expensive. And so as a result of that, you have to charge more because you still need to have margins to your books and everything. And so I think, but when are people happy to pay more? Well, they believe in your identity, right?
Right. Yeah.
They value the fact that you are clear about who you are and what you're doing. Okay, so the importance thing is huge. One other thing I want to touch on before we get into ideas of how you build this is, why is this hard? So like, what are some of the reasons, Marlee, why getting to the place of clarity and pull through when it comes to identity, why is it difficult?
I think the obvious one is time.
Yeah.
I think so many, like you said at the beginning, so many of our listeners, even myself as a PhD student, just having the time to step back and reflect. And this is a big concept, and it takes a lot of time to kind of first come to life a bit of who people are in that company, but then also to articulate it. It's hard. And it's not a quick thing, not a quick fix. And finding that time can be very difficult. And then I think for those that do take the time, then it's a whole another thing to follow through on aligning your structure, your policies, your practices. That can also be really hard to do, especially when things have been we've done things the same way for so long. It's hard to change those things that we feel like are core to who we are, but maybe aren't supporting that. But habits are a powerful thing. Yeah.
No, the time when I agree, I think that's spot on, is no one's going to kind of tap you on the shoulder one day and say, hey, did you remember to create a day or block off time to get really clear on your organizational identity? That normally does not happen.
Yeah.
And so it's like, there won't be a day that pops up and looks like the ideal time frame to do this.
Right.
Like this is going to require leaders to actively, intentionally, and thoughtfully make room for this.
Yeah.
You've got to prioritize it.
Yeah, and it may not be something that you see the immediate benefit of either.
Great point. I mean, this is not like, hey, yeah, we took Friday and we got out of the office and we kind of sorted all this out. And man, we came in Monday and you wouldn't believe the impact. That's not how that story goes normally.
Yeah.
Not quite. Okay, so we're acknowledging the fact that, hey, although this is important, it's tough. It's difficult to be good and to thrive in this area. And so it's kind of with that in mind that we want to spend a lot of our time today focused on this question of the gap that might exist between where an organization stands today, who you are, who you want to be, like the gap that exists between where you are today to who you aspirationally have in mind for your identity. How do you close the gap? And so we're going to kind of be going through these. We've got 5 ideas for you, kind of 5 categories or reasons to help you close the gap and grow in the space of organizational identity. So where do you want to start, Marlee?
Yeah, so leadership is the big one.
Okay, so talk about that.
In my mind. So I think org identity a lot of times is a very top-down thing, and it's got to be the people that are leading the way. So leaders need to define and embody and communicate who they are and why they add value. And when leaders do it really well, employees follow suit. A lot of times, it's assuming you have people that are a good fit, I guess. But for example, I had an interesting example of this a couple weeks ago. My mom's a teacher, and one of her good friends does professional development for the state for principals in a different state. And she sat down with a room full of principals, and she was like, okay, your goals are you want your teachers to motivate your students, get to know them, adapt their learning preferences and skills so that they grow. Ultimately, we want kids to grow. And then she had laid out sticky notes, and she told the principals to write down the names of all of the teachers they wanted to motivate. So they wrote down all the names, and she noticed.
The principals are writing down the names of the teachers in their respective schools.
Yes, in their schools.
Got it.
And they wrote down all the names, and she noticed they were all last names. So she said, okay, write down their first names. Maybe 50% of the principals could do it.
Wow.
Then she said, write down their husbands' names. 1 or 2 could do it. Write down how many kids they have. Maybe 1 or 2 could do it again. And her whole point to say was, you want them to embody these values of getting to know their students, engaging them, motivating them, helping them grow, and you don't even know their first name. You don't even know their husband's name. And I'm sure that is not the case everywhere, but I think that was a good picture for me of, so often leaders ask things of their employees that they're not actually living out those values. And I think that's a big piece of identity. If you want learning and growth to be that in a school, to be who you are as a school, then it needs to be top down embodied. And the same is true in any organization, sports team, wherever you're at.
To recap real quickly, because to me that is quite an example. So approximately half of the principals knew the first names of the teachers.
Yes.
And half didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was your mom's reaction to that?
I think it's just one of those like shocking things, and it's easy to be like, oh, like what horrible people, but I think it's super easy when you have, Mrs. Smith or whoever it is.
I don't know. I mean, I've never been a principal, but
their day to day is so fast paced, and it requires intentionality.
Yeah.
And I think it just draws attention to when you're asking people to be a certain way, you've got to make the time to be that yourself and to check in. As a leader, yes, you have a lot going on, but you have to take the time to check in and do it and be that person.
So, Marlee, that example highlights one of the leadership principles we've talked extensively about on the podcast of if it isn't happening in you, it will never happen through you. So imagine, like, let's say hypothetically that in just one of those schools of the 50% that didn't know, let's imagine one of their core values that's intended to load up to their organizational identity was caring. And if I'm saying as the leader of the school, kind of the identified formal leader of the school, that, hey, we're going to be an organization that is caring in what we do. And I don't know the first names of my teachers. Mm-hmm. That's not a great spot to be in.
Not great.
And I think we're being kind of kind in our description of that. But when we talk about this whole notion of organizational identity and how do you bring that to life within your company, your school, whatever it might be, to your point, it's got to start at the top.
It has to.
It's got to start at the top with alignment and authenticity in the things that we're saying we want to be true to. The leaders are being true to those things.
Absolutely. And that's not to say you can't lead up. If you're an employee and you see that there's misalignment and you have influence in a lot of times.
Sure.
In a lot of ways from the bottom up. But it is so essential that the people calling the shots, making the decisions, that have control over all these other things, work structure, reward systems, all of that, that is part of the duty, in my opinion, of leadership, is to hold yourself to that standard.
Yep. And I'll say this, although I agree with you on the concept of the ability to lead up, those people don't last.
No, and it's hard.
Like, they don't stick around. They fight the good fight, and they're typically, they're high-level caring people. They're ambitious. They're hungry. They're driven. They have energy. They fight the good fight for some period of time, but they're not fools.
Yeah.
And so if they get to the point where it's like, you know what, this isn't changing. Like, there's someplace else out there that would value me and what I'm trying to bring to the table, and they go those places.
Yeah. Yeah.
And who can blame them? Yeah, who can blame them? Okay, so again, back to this, like, closing the gap. How do you close the gap to grow your organizational identity in terms of clarity and purpose. And so step number one, like leadership, we got to start there. Then we progress into, and now we're talking about kind of how we think of culture and value. So Marlee, talk a little bit about kind of the second component on how culture drives identity.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit before this too about sometimes culture and identity get a little bit conflated.
Yep.
And kind of the difference there is identity is like really who you are at your core in words, actions, everything. And culture is kind of what happens from that.
The behaviors.
It's the behaviors, the things that change. And culture can change a little bit more than identity can. Like innovation as a value can look a lot of different ways. And all those different ways it looks is more your culture. And the word is more identity.
Yep.
But values and different behaviors, things, processes, stuff like that should be modeled so that your identity is reinforced. And a lot of times this happens in like very day-to-day interactions. So just caring, if that's one of the things, asking, how's your husband? How's this?
Right.
But I wanted to pull this example in from Starbucks. So Drew actually had me listen to in a podcast, the Acquired podcast, to learn.
That makes it sound like you didn't want to listen.
Oh, it was great. Learned all about Starbucks, and now I'm definitely a Starbucks fan from listening to it. But one of the things that really stuck out to me was Howard Schultz, the founder. One of his main goals with Starbucks was to build a kind of company that provides respect and dignity to his workers. So to me, that like respect, dignity, humanity was like a big identity sticking point for them. And so many of their actions as a company reflect this. So like early on, the name Starbucks writes names on everybody's cups. And he said the reason for that was that employees who he said knew the company better than him were like, hey, we should be doing this. And so they did. And that turned into this like personalization, customization thing that Starbucks has going on for it. But other things, other than just listening to employees are called partners, and they have access to so many benefits that shows Starbucks' investment in their respect and dignity. So the first was like Beanstalk, where employees get stock units, and healthcare for medical, dental, and vision insurance, even in places that may not already have like healthcare for people, like different countries and things like that. And they have a college achievement program, and there's a big list on their website that is not just those things. But I think all those little actions, it's their value of respect and dignity to workers shining through.
So it's putting teeth to the words you put on the walls is really what we're talking about.
Yep.
And we've talked about that even in other episodes of there's no shortage of examples out there where you walk into the corporate headquarters for company X, whatever it might be, and up on the walls you have these like really artistically well done, beautiful looking words that someone spent a ton of time and money on. And the problem is they don't exist within the organization in a real way.
Yeah.
And so I think what Howard Schultz did an incredible job with, and then where Starbucks continues to thrive, is this whole idea of they first got clear on like, well, who do we want to be? How do we want to be? We then create these, respect as one example, and now we kind of engineer the culture such that there's teeth to it. Like
our actions match.
Correct. There's alignment. There's alignment there. And I always tell people you're better off not even coming up with your values if you aren't going to do that.
Yeah. And I think this is another one of those things too, where coming up with the words takes time, but the culture to change to match them also takes time.
Yes.
And I think it's less about it being perfect and more about taking the steps towards it.
Yep.
And implementing things that support that culture.
And I think, maybe a visual to kind of mental model here to put with this as people are kind of listening, maybe you're driving down the road, whatever it is these two terms we've identified of identity and culture, and they aren't the same thing. And so I think if you have this image in your mind of a pendulum, and the identity is what it is, if we've kind of labeled it and we know what the words are, your culture is going to act more kind of like a pendulum, and that it's going to swing a little bit back and forth over the ebbs and flows of your company and your business and that type of thing. Of course, we always want it to swing in a way where we have better alignment toward who we say we want to be identity-wise. But just know as a leader or business owner, like there will be periods of time where your culture, that pendulum is swinging a little bit in the opposite direction where you want it to be, which is when it's time to act, right? But I think it's going to happen. And that's to your point, Marlee, of like culture, they're not the same thing, and that culture will have a little more ebb and flow to it sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
Unfortunately. We don't want it to, but it will. Okay, so we have, as we think about our 5 ways to fill the gap, the importance of leadership, the importance of culture and it being driven by values and rituals. Now we get into a little bit of like the team, right? So employees, the composition of your team. We now get into the people element, which many people have said over the years, like the only problems I have in my company are people problems. So like this is a biggie. So Marlee, talk a little bit about kind of the people element.
Yeah, so I think this is really about making sure, like selecting, engaging, developing people in a way that reinforces your values and introduces them. So I think there's like 2 pieces to that. It's getting people that are a good fit that can drive that identity forward. Then it's also like your actual hiring process and being honest about who you are and where you're at with that.
Okay, so let's take those one at a time. So the first one you said is the actual people, right?
Yes.
So talk a little bit about like how should a company or an organization go about figuring out who that is?
Well, I kind of wanted to throw that question to you.
Oh, gosh.
With all of your profiling experience and values experience out there in the real world.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Well, I think it comes, there are several things that you want to do to better understand who you're looking for. And so, there's key questions you always want to think about internally. So one, a simple one would be like, who seems to meet success here? When you think and study the people who have been part of your organization over time, who you would label as kind of all-stars, rock stars, high achievers, well, what seems to be at the core of that for them? And so quantitatively and qualitatively. Like quantitatively, are you using some assessment measures, personality tests, whatever kind of fits right there? But do you know how these people are wired from a quantitative, objective standpoint? It's very important. Secondly, from a qualitative standpoint, like when asked to describe these people, how do you describe them? What are the words that come to mind? What types of experiences do they seem to have historically or in their background that have positioned them well to be successful in your organization? That could be inclusive of formal training, academic training, whatever that could look like for them. It could be life experiences. It could be certain activities they were part of. Did they work a job while in high school? Did they have an athletic past? There's certain things that typically come along with that. So you want to study their backgrounds really, really well. That's important. And there's different ways to go about this, but I think the key is to be incorporating both qualitative and quantitative data to inform the picture. It's so much more than like, we liked her on the interview.
Yes.
Or my buddy in Toledo says great things about him.
Right.
That's great. Like I hope he does. But it's incredible to me at times how thinly we are making decisions about who to welcome to your organization.
For sure. And I think the flip side of that too is like the quantitative data to inform like what is needed too.
Yeah, that too, competencies.
Like what do we need in this job? What do we need in this space? What do we need on this team? I think all of those are really important questions that sometimes get skipped over.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So we need to, like, what are the core competencies that we can't live without? Like, I don't care how charismatic someone is. If they can't do the job effectively, we are going to have problems.
Right.
And I think, so you need to know that for the role. You must also know that in terms of the organization of like, is this person going to be a fit here? Like we believe A, B, and C, whatever that is.
Right.
If we are really, really big on teamwork and cohesiveness and working collaboratively, and this person's track record says he or she is more of kind of a lone wolf independent contractor mentality, bad idea.
Right.
And I don't care how productive they are. I don't care what kind of points they can put on the board from a results standpoint. You're going to clash.
Yes.
And so that might be a decision you don't want to make.
Yeah.
So from a selection standpoint, those are some of the things that would come to mind.
Absolutely.
What was the second part?
So more hiring process.
The process itself.
So the process itself, a lot of times you come in and that's where you're first introduced to an organization's values.
Yeah.
And I think the example that comes to mind right now is there's this big push to return to work. But there you have a lot of these employees that were hired knowing that flexibility was a big deal. And they were hired with the assumption that, I'm going to have a really flexible job. And that's one of their big values. Well, now you've got all these companies saying, come back to work. And they were expecting that this would be a flexible company.
Ooh.
And that creates misalignment, frustration. And it's maybe that's more of a circumstantial thing. But easy example of that. And it happens in other ways too.
Yeah. So maybe someone kind of onboarded into the organization when they were in this like willy-nilly, we're trying to figure it out stage.
Right.
And as the world has increasingly returned to, I guess, what currently is normal, doesn't really work with what they thought they were getting into.
Right. Like the expectations are misaligned. But I think it also comes in, an organization is like, we're really trying to be this thing and they're not quite there yet, maybe not transparent about how they're not quite there yet.
Yep.
And they come in expecting that they're going to be one way, and that's just not how it is.
And I think as an organization, you got to try to land somewhere in the middle, because it's normal for there to be tension between like who you think you are and how you've always thought about the way you go about your business, and then how that might not jive with the term we see a bunch is like, the today's working world or whatever, like the kind of the norms of the day. Like, what if those are at odds with each other? And that's where I think you got to try to land somewhere in the middle, because you might need to evolve, but at the same time, if you try to be someone you aren't, it won't end well for anybody.
Yeah, and I think to that point, another reason why identity is so important is it gives you that central thing that how it looks can change, but it gives you that central who you are.
Okay, let's go to this next one here. So we're on 4 of 5. We got 2 more we want to cover here, Marlee. The fourth idea and kind of category for you to be thinking about to help you bring added clarity and purpose to your identity involves organizational structure. So when we say structure, we're talking about what are the systems, like these are words that scare some people here, so just bear with us here. Systems, processes, right? Don't run and hide from systems and processes. A lot of people say that until you have systems and processes, you don't even have a business. But Marlee, what role do those systems and processes play in upholding your identity?
Yeah, and I think as an IO, this is one of the ones that I like to kind of geek out about.
This is your gravy right here. So go for it.
Yeah, so this is like, you have the team, you've got everybody doing their stuff, but it's kind of the hardware around that supports team functioning. And there's, you have communication processes and lots of different things. I have a very concrete example. Somebody in my lab was working with a construction company, and the company was wanting to become more collaborative. And all of their trailers were in separate places. And so their solution to being a more collaborative company as a value was to move the trailers and join the people that needed to interact with each other on a day-to-day basis. And guess what? Collaboration went up. And it was something so easy about the structure of where they were working. Yeah. So a lot of times these more structural things are more simple fixes. They just take a second to step back and realize, what do we actually need? How do we support the people to do what we're asking them to do?
That's a great example too of what you see some in the habits research about how environment beats willpower.
Yeah.
So they could have just kind of pulled everyone together and given them these marching orders of like, hey, go be more collaborative. Right. Like, we want to be a more collaborative organization. Here's why it matters. This is what we're after. Like, go forth, go do your thing. And I doubt it would have worked that well.
Right.
Because the intent, which then triggers the willpower, it isn't nearly as effective as if you alter and engineer the environment in a way that aligns to the intention. Well, now it just kind of does it for me.
Yeah, it makes it easy, accessible.
Yeah, you just show up and it's happening already.
Right.
That's a good example. Interesting. And there are plenty of others as like, how do you create the right system to, you think about examples of like, all right, hey, we want to, I remember reading about how, I think it was either Slack or someone, they said no virtual meetings on Fridays. Yeah. They're like, hey, if you need to meet, like, walk down the hall. And that, that only works if you're kind of in a centralized, I understand that location. But they were like, why do we have people getting on virtual calls who are in the same building? Right. We don't do that anymore. Right. Like, we want to try to create more of a culture where we're actually like spending time and getting in the presence of the people on our teams and that type of stuff. So there's lots of examples of this.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then we get into our last one here, number 5, which is utilizing measures and rewards of some type to reinforce the identity of the organization. And so these could be performance metrics, whatever it might be, but like, how do we use and structure things the right way to maintain and kind of create the identity that we want? So like, what types of rewards are we talking about?
I think these are what we think of as like incentives. Yeah. And there's an organization that they're a research and development organization, and their goal is to do like state-of-the-art research, cutting edge, push the boundaries, research in like personnel management, team development, leadership development. And they have project managers that manage really big accounts and don't always have time to think creative, but that's so central to what they do. So every year they set aside time everybody turns in a one-pager, lets them think creatively outside of the box, whatever they want to do. And if it's good enough, it gets funded, like a lot of money. And that's an easy way to incentivize that creative thing, even though creativity is not necessarily this bottom line product.
Yep.
But that for them, that worked because they're research and development. So I think it can look a lot of different ways. I think when it comes to like rewards and measures, an easy example is a lot of times we want people to work in teams, and then you get rewarded and measured on performance as an individual.
Yep.
And that really undermines teamwork in a lot of ways. You're not being a team player and stuff like that. And there's certainly a place for things that are not teamwork. But when you're trying to work in a team, if you have team members that are being rewarded individually, that can be a really big problem.
Yeah.
So making sure that metrics and these more traditional incentivizing things are aligned with what you're going for.
Yeah, because what do you do when like what's best for the individual is different from what's best for the team? And
Absolutely.
How people make decisions accordingly, with what we reinforce gets repeated.
Yeah, and that's, a tough challenge for any organization to figure out. It looks different in every context.
It is, but I know, I've seen so many examples over the years of companies, and I love this example of they have their core values and they're very explicit about them, and employee compensation is tied to the degree to which they're fulfilling core values.
Yeah.
So a percentage of their, depending on how they're paid, whether it's salaried, there's of course different ways you do that. But in this, let's use the easy example of they're paid a salary, and they have a certain percentage of how that salary can fluctuate. It could be that way. It could be that their bonus opportunities, and your bonus is tied directly to the degree to which they feel like the leaders feel like you are executing or not executing the core values. And so that's really putting some teeth to this.
Yeah.
Of like, we're paying attention.
Right.
And if you're doing this well, and if you understand what the values are, and if we see evidence of this in your day in and day out, you'll have an opportunity to earn a bonus. And if you don't, you won't.
Absolutely. And I'm assuming with those examples, like they've definitely had to take some time to really think through this
For
stuff
sure.
And really explicitly lay out what does it mean to do this
and
stuff.
Provided feedback along the way,
Right.
because it should never be a surprise during your like once a year annual review.
Right. And then just another thing to point out is like structure needs to be supportive in all these cases. So all of these 5 things really work together.
Right.
They're not necessarily standalone.
No. There's an interrelatedness to each of these. And I think probably one of the biggest, I think, points of this whole thing is now, especially now that we've kind of gone through ideas for closing the gap, is like this is going to take time. It's going to take thoughtfulness, and it's probably going to take some problem solving.
Absolutely.
You aren't going to just kind of dial up this blueprint and hit the go button on it and everything is just fantastic.
Yeah, we want it to be that way then.
Yeah.
But we started this episode off, you were like almost doctor, and I was like one day at a time. It's the same thing with this.
There you go. Yeah. How do you create an improved and I think clarity in your organizational identity? It's just that, right?
One day at a time.
You're spending one day at a time on it. Okay, I know we need to kind of move toward wrapping this up. Marlee, what about any kind of closing thoughts or final thoughts from you related to the discussion?
I think this is one of the most important things organizations can do and continually return to. I don't think there's ever really a stopping point on this kind of thing. Organizations are always changing, evolving, which means this is not a one and done deal.
Yeah.
And it's something to keep returning to because it should be the foundation that drives everything, every action for everybody in your organization. Right.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think just, maybe a final thought for me is I'll sync it up to kind of where we're headed very quickly here as the year, we're in Q4, obviously, and the year is rapidly kind of drawing to a close, which is kind of wild to say that. But a lot of people, as they get to the latter part of their year here, if you're on a calendar year cycle, they'll be doing, I hope, kind of a healthy dose of like reflection and evaluation, and they're kind of looking back and they're thinking about a lot of things. I can promise you this, one of the things they'll be thinking about is how they feel about the organization they are a part of.
Yeah.
And in the midst of doing that, I know that, as one of our owners here at AMPLOS, one of the things I always want people to feel as they reflect is for them to be proud of what they're a part of, like proud of who the organization is, proud of the opportunities they have to be a part of it, and like just proud to be in it, proud to be on the team. And I'll say this, I know I'm not the only one that feels that way. Like there's no shortage of leaders out there in organizations that want that. And you just simply won't have that if you aren't good in this area.
Yeah.
If you lack organizational identity, people won't be proud to be a part of it.
They don't know what they're proud to be.
Yeah, they don't know how. Like, you haven't provided enough of a roadmap for them to understand what they're a part of, or like why it matters, or what it even is. So I think in the other thing you think about is like people that are proud to be a part of what they do, think about how they go about their business compared to those that aren't.
Yeah, I mean, way more engaged.
I mean, you take pride in your performance. And that's what we want at the end of the day, is that we want a collection of people on a team who take pride in what they're doing, and you can really trust where that'll lead from an outcome standpoint. So maybe just as a final charge to those people that are tuned in today of, have you created a blueprint and a roadmap from an identity standpoint that people can be proud of? And there's no shortage of reasons to get on board with that as quickly as you can.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Soon to be Dr. Marlee Johnson. We're going to just keep saying that, and before you know it, it won't be soon to be anymore.
One day.
But thank you to our listeners for tuning in. As always, grateful for each of you all in our community. And if you get a moment and are finding value in what we're doing, please click over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing and how we can continue to serve you better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.